Hi, and welcome to this week's Wu Wei Wisdom Life Lessons teaching. It's great to be back with you all. This week we are looking at how you can comfort and support your sad inner child. Now, if your inner child is deeply upset, lonely, or withdrawn, this can have a profound impact on your life, your relationships, and your future potential. Well, in this teaching, we'll be revealing the root causes of inner child sadness and what you can do to release your inner child from its emotional prison so you can both be happy, healthy, and in your flow. Okay, David, so I know you work with all of your clients on inner child issues, but is this concept of a sad inner child, a withdrawn inner child, a common thing that you encounter?
Unfortunately, yes, I think this is one of the most common manifestations that you would get of that part of your mind that we're calling the inner child demonstrating themselves. And normally that's when people come and search for help or assistance because they have this part of the mind that's extremely sad, withdrawn, isolating themselves, and they really don't know how to deal with it. And so it might be a good idea if we can go over by what we mean by the inner child. That might be a good starting point. And we've done lots of teachings on this. And it's a label. That's all it is. It's a label for a part of your mind. You may already identify this part of the mind. You may be now calling it your ego, your dark side, your subconscious, your emotional side, the devil that sits on your shoulder. It has lots of names. I'd like you to consider the name the inner child, because that label allows you to look at things from a different perception. And this is what we would do here in this video. We'll show you a new perception that you can look at this part of the mind that's always sad, that's always looking at worst case scenarios, that's always on the negative side.
And so I guess is what you're talking about, David, it's more than a sense of being sad or withdrawn or feeling hopeless because of a recent event or a specific thing. It's more like an ongoing, pervasive background feeling that just is always with you. And is that the sad inner child?
I think that's a good way to describe it, Alex. It's not as a result of one event, a loss or a death or a redundancy. It's not as a result of one event. It's more of an overarching way that you're living your life. And then it's almost like what will happen then is you'll look at every event as almost a confirmation bias, as a self-fulfilling prophecy. So you'll be saying, well, there you are, that's proof. Oh, that always happens to me. This is always the way it is. It never works out right for me. So if you're saying those kind of words, that would indicate this sad, negative type of child mind that's stuck.
And with this feeling of sadness, again, in your experience working with clients, does it tend to be coupled with this idea of wanting to withdraw away from life or shut ourselves away, or a kind of a pervasive feeling of loneliness? Do the two often go hand in hand?
It does, Alex. But when you're always talking about, and this is where a lot of people get confused when doing the inner child work, you're absolutely right. That's how it would present itself. Being isolated, not being want to be involved with things, not being want to be put their head above the parapet, very isolating, very quiet, very negative. But you must also remember the emotional pendulum. When we're talking about the inner child, it can be the way that you described it, but it can be also the person that's quiet on the outside, but inside is like seething. It's like the anger and the resentment is bubbling up inside of them, that they see themselves as always getting the raw end of the deal. They see themselves as always the one that suffers. They look at other people and they see them doing well, and they have this deep sense of resentment deep inside of them. that normally they wouldn't show to other people, except perhaps to close family members, but they're living all of the time with this sense of, why me, poor me, it's always me, I always get the raw end of the deal. So there's the pendulum on this inner child that we're talking about now.
And so there's a paradox or an irony there, I guess, David, because in a way, our sad inner child is withdrawing. It doesn't, if it feels hard done to, or it doesn't want to experience any more emotional pain. But there is a lot of pain and turmoil going on within us, even though they're trying to withdraw from the external world, whether that's withdrawing from meaningful, authentic relationships with people, withdrawing from opportunities in life to do with our career or friendships. We're withdrawing, but at the same time it's like we're not finding the inner peace that the inner child is searching for, because we're withdrawing into ourselves, into that kind of inner turmoil of, it shouldn't be this way. What happened shouldn't have happened, whatever the inner child is stuck on.
Well, you used two words at the beginning of that question, which makes this work very challenging, and some people would say difficult. And this is what we try and clear up. Paradox. It's very paradoxical what it does. It does one thing and it says something else. So it really is living in this paradox. And this is what keeps it stuck, because now it's experiencing something that happened to it when it was a child that it didn't understand or didn't relate to what was happening. So it wants and it believes that it should be loved, for instance, that it should be cared for, that it should be nurtured, that it should be always top of the tree, the prince or the princess, that it should have had this wonderful life where mummy and daddy really love it and nothing really bad happens to it. And so it has this ideal, what I call the utopian, the Disney world, where everybody and everything is just nice, just pretty. Everybody's happy. I call it roses grow round the door, bunny rabbits jump in the field, I skip along, everybody agrees with me. There's no criticism, there's no upset. Everything's the way that I would ideally like it to be. That's the way the world should be. The reality doesn't match that. And so when you're a child, if there was no one there to teach or to guide you, which for many of us there's never this perfect parent. And so therefore the inner child now is faced with this ideal utopian world, but then it has to deal with the reality of the real world, of how the world actually is for them. And so the inner child, when you were a child, and I think the ages of 6 or 9 are very relevant, not exact, but very relevant, good place for you to start to do your inner child work around 6 and 9, is experiencing something that doesn't match to what it would ideally like, its plan. And then how does it deal with that? Well, it can deal with that in many ways. And here's the pendulum, here's the paradox. It can swing from one side and shut itself down and protect itself, put on layers, be invisible. This is one of the things my clients say to me lots of times. When I was a child, I had to be invisible. I had to keep myself quiet, subdue myself, hide myself away. But always, when you're doing the inner child work, always remember the opposite, the paradox, the opposite. So this could be the child that's very, very loud, very aggressive. This could be the child that wants to be responsible, to make their parents better, to help their parents, to be responsible for their parents, not to shut themselves away, to stand forward and say, well, if you can't sort out this relationship, then I must be responsible. And so this is what makes this inner child work difficult. I find it very challenging, and it keeps me engaged to always be thinking about the pendulum And when I'm working with my clients, I've always got the emotional pendulum in mind, this energetic, that even though they tell me one side of the story, there is always this other side that's bubbling up inside. And when you do this work, and if you've clicked onto this video because you think this relates to you, this sad and withdrawn inner child, that may be the thing that's presenting to you. And you may understand what I'm saying when I'm saying shutting yourself away, being invisible. But always remember the other side, because that can be as damaging to you as well. And it can be paradoxical. But you may have this inner rage, as some of my clients say, this inner feeling that you almost have to work hard to keep subdued, because if you took the lid off this, it would be like a volcano exploding, and you don't want that to happen. So now you're on the emotional pendulum, very typical of the inner child, and perhaps a good life lesson to learn in this video.
And I think, David, that regardless of where we find ourselves on the emotional pendulum, and obviously we're talking about today the more yin aspects,
Yes.
which is the being withdrawn, we're being
Yes.
sad, being lonely, rather than the yang, which is more aggressive, being forceful, pushing out. But it's the underlying cause of where these emotions are being created from, and it's based on the beliefs that you touched upon, that most often, correct me if I'm wrong, that we believed when we were a child, we were rejected, there was a deep unfairness, think we were unloved, we lost trust in people, all sorts of kind of inner child conclusions were drawn when we were a young child, and really quite rightly, because at that time we weren't cognitively mature, we didn't have a mature way of thinking, so we, in our childish way, we had to draw conclusions. But is it the beliefs that are really at the root of the emotional expression of sadness that we're talking about now?
Yes, I think you've explained it extremely well there, Alex. It's when we were meeting those experiences as a child between the age of 6 and 9, so we were experiencing the emotions, we could experience the unfairness, the injustice. It wasn't the way that we wanted it. And that's really when you hear a child say, it's not fair. What the child is saying, it's not the way I want it. So when you hear your physical children go, Mommy, it's not fair, what they're saying, it's not the way I want it to be. And so when you were a child and these things are real, I'm not saying that you imagine them. It could be extreme cruelty for a lot of my clients. You know, I often work with my clients and think, my goodness, how could you have come through that in your childhood? The cruelty, the taking away of emotions, the criticizing, the judgmental. It's amazing. If this is you, I mean, I'm just amazed how you got through it. And to think you're a victim of it, to me, I don't understand, because I always say to my clients, it's another V word. You are victorious. You are victorious. I can tell you, in 45 years of doing this work, I've heard some horrific stories. And yet there's something about you that I would call Shen, that deep spiritual nature that came through that. The job of doing the inner child and the job of what we're doing here is for us to go back and reflect. Because as you said, the inner child's experiencing that from the mind of a 6, 7, 8-year-old. It hasn't got the cognitive reasoning, the maturity, the knowledge to understand it. So it makes conclusions based on the child. Don't forget, if this is you, there wasn't many years ago you were believing in Santa Claus and the Tooth Fairy. This is the type of mindset we're talking about. This is not wrong. This is not stupid. This is nothing. This is just a child maturing. But what happens, you see, is those beliefs that the child had, and normally the biggest one I call the vow, VOW, the vow, will always circle around a statement that sounds something like this. There's something wrong with me. Not there's something wrong with dysfunctional with a house, or there's dysfunctional with my parents' emotional health. You can't come to that conclusion. So a child does what a child would do. There's something wrong with me. Then he steps onto the pendulum, because now the child then will start to tell lies. I'm not good enough. So if you've ever said that to yourself, any time in your life, there is an inner child in your mind that needs help. I'm not good enough. If you think about that statement, the statement itself, write that statement down on a piece of paper. I am not good enough. It doesn't even make sense. Not good enough for what? For whom? For why? Who's making the judgment? Which part of you is not good enough? The whole part of you? And then who's making the judgment? And so that's very important. Second one, I can't cope. This always amazes me, you know. As I've said earlier, Alex, you listen to my clients and they are so amazing. Mm-hmm. The dysfunctionality, the difficulty, the problems that they've encountered, and then they're trying to say they can't cope. They are a coping machine. One of the best attributes that they have is to cope. And then the third one is I'm unlovable. Or they may replace unlovable with unworthy or no value. And again, it doesn't make sense. Because if love is an emotional feeling, what he's saying, there are other people can't create a feeling of love for you. Why? And then they say, well, there's something wrong with me. There's something missing, you see? And so this is what the child is going on in your mind. This inner child thought these complicated things. And then from the age of 7, 8, 9, what you've been doing is layering another layer on top of another layer on top of another layer, self-fulfilling prophecy. Then you withdraw. Then it's confirmation bias. Then you think bad of yourself. Then you see the thing that makes you feel bad of yourself. Then you become sad. Then you start to turn in on yourself. Then you start to criticize yourself. And that's why, if this is you and you come to this video because of the title, you've got some very important work to do to go back to re-educate that part of your mind.
And so, I mean, this is the inner child work now that we talk about on so many of our teachings. And of course, I will put a link in the show notes to some of those teachings for you. But please do check out our whole back catalogue on our YouTube channel. But really, I read that word victorious, not a victim, really stuck with me. And also the self-blame thing, the inner child making the vow that everything is my fault. It must be me. So the inner child sees itself as a victim and blames itself. Those two things. Yes. And are they the things that we need to speak to our inner child about, that part of our mind, to basically explain the truth to it?
Exactly. That's exactly right. You explain the truth to it because it's seeing it through the eyes of an inner child. It's seeing it through the eyes of a 7, 8-year-old. And so it doesn't understand the truth. It's very narrow. It's almost looking at life through a pinprick. And what the work is, and the inner child work and the golden thread technique that we talk about, you have to learn some techniques because the inner child will use emotions, sadness, rejection, feeling of being overwhelmed, feeling of not being able to deal with life. So it will create all of these feelings, these what I call red light feelings. But what it's doing is creating these feelings to kind of keep itself safe, because it believes in a concept of emotional safety and emotional protection. But that's why the teaching that I try and pass on to you on every video, to me, is life-changing. You are the creator of your emotions. You cannot be the victim of them. And if you think about that, that is the basis that if you believe that you create your emotions, how can you be emotionally safe? How can you protect yourself from emotions that are internal, not external? And here is the problem of this sad child. It believes that it's being attacked. It believes emotions come raining in on it. And it has to build this invisible wall, this igloo that it can hide inside and keep itself safe, because the nasty world outside is so aggressive and so bad for it that it can't move on. And that can only be broken by emotional education, by finding a way, a technique, and we're offering you a technique. I hope it works for you. The technique is emotional education, is going back into your mind through whatever method that I would use, a meditation, a focusing of your mind, a sitting quiet, listening to our teachings, finding the words that work for you, but going back and then doing something. And then this is why I like the analogy of the inner child. Doing something that your physical parents couldn't do. So you almost become the spiritual person. You go back and speak and educate your mind with knowledge, with information, with answering its questions. And then it's like, I don't know, it's like watering a plant. It's like nourishing a plant. You'll be surprised how quickly the child will respond to this and to grow. And those old thoughts about poo me, sad me, the world's against me, feel sorry for me, why me, why me, why does it always happen to me? All those start to dissolve away as it grows, as it sees things through a different lens, or rather the way that I would say it as a Taoist, a widening of the lens. So you're not looking at life through a pinhole, you're widening your perception. So you see, because there are difficult things, there are challenges in life. Life is not always easy. Life is not a utopia. There are difficult people, difficult challenges. So you've got to teach the child how it deals with that.
And also just to say, David, sometimes, well, as you said at the outset, it is appropriate to experience the emotion of sadness. Sometimes it's also appropriate for us to withdraw slightly, go with it into ourselves. But that should be almost as a healing process, as a time for self-reflection, as a time to rebalance ourselves, to get our mind straight, as you suggest, through meditation, as a time for self-inquiry, not as a time to sit within the emotions and work up the inner turmoil and go into a cycle of self-sabotage. I mean, we've done several teachings, which I can put a link to in the show notes, on self-sabotage. But often it's our sad, withdrawn inner child that starts to self-sabotage because it believes it's not going to survive out there.
Well, that's important, because the example that you get, sometimes it's good just to pull back and to reconnect. But the difference is that should be a proactive action, not a
choice,
reactive action. You're making a choice. So now the inner child, this sad inner child, doesn't want to take responsibility for making a choice, doesn't want to be criticized again, doesn't want to be judged. It worries about what other people think about it. It tries to people please. So what it's doing all the time, it's reacting. It's on the back foot. It's going down, making itself smaller and smaller and smaller and more invisible. And that's what it has come to, that conclusion. The best way, and this is back to your paradox, the best way to deal with this is, if I make myself invisible, nobody will know I'm there, and my emotions will stay intact. But it never works. And so it's faced with a dilemma. The solution it's come to is not working. So what does it do? It does it more.
Yeah.
It withdraws more.
Rather than thinking, hold on, this strategy is not working. And I suppose the good news is, as soon as we do that inner child work and we start putting our head above the parapet, not being led by our emotions so much, stepping out of our comfort zone, our inner child begins to trust us, and it begins to see that everything is not all negative. Everything is not going to have a necessarily negative outcome, that actually there are positive opportunities. So through that kind of slowly stepping out, the inner child starts to see the world through clearer lenses in its glasses.
Well, one of the things about the sadhu as inner child as well, which is very important, we haven't touched on yet, is it sees itself as being alone. It sees itself as being, as we said, isolated, but even more than that, it sees itself as there's no one it can trust. It's paddling its own canoe, and it doesn't want to paddle its own canoe. It doesn't even think it can paddle its own canoe, but it's having to do it. And when you do the inner child work and the golden thread work, and you start to build up a really good relationship with that part of your mind, and the Taoists think about it as a coming together, not a separation. So right now, the inner child is separated and isolated and on its own and dealing with this nasty, horrible world, and it's trying to deal with it without any help, and it can't trust anybody to help. That's when you're coming together, and this is the basis of the teaching and the life lesson, that you come together. So instead of being two independent opposites, paradoxical, the two ends, you're coming together in a oneness, in a Wu Wei, in your flow. And that's what Wu Wei means, being in your flow, effortless effort, being able to work together. The way that I would use it, and I say to my clients, instead of looking at two individuals like two horses pulling a carriage, and at the moment, the two horses are going in different ways and the carriage isn't moving forward. We have to bring them together so we're going in the same direction like a team. So if your child is sad, isolated, upset, this is how I work with my clients. I think about it as a beautiful child, not a monster, not a demon, not a devil, a beautiful child, like down deep in a dark room or a dark cave, and so scared, so not understanding, so timid, and it will bite your head off if you get close to it. And we have to find our way down to that child. We have to sit with it, and we have to talk to it. The most important thing we have to do is to answer its questions about life. And this is why I do these videos, so you have got the answers. Because there are things that are going to happen in this world, in its life, that it won't like. And we have to say that we're there by your side. We're together. You are not isolated. I will not leave you. I cannot leave you. And we will be a team going on. And we've done so many teachings about the things to say to your inner child. But if your inner child is giving you this sadness, it's another way that it's crying out for help, for guidance, for someone to hold its hand, to walk with it, to show it the light, to bring it out of that dark place and to start to live its life, to have fun, to play in the sunshine, to get on with life, to flourish and to be the best that it can be. And that's what this teaching is about for you. And if this applies to you, there's no better time than right now to begin this process. There's lots of resources here. Please look at them, make up your own words, and do it because you are worth it.
Thank you, David. And as I say, please do check out the links in our show notes for many more teachings that can help you with this inner child reparenting process. I do hope you have enjoyed this teaching. Please do let us know and perhaps share it with someone else who you think would also benefit. David works with clients all over the world every week by Zoom video call on exactly these sort of inner child issues. If you'd like to learn more about David's consultations, I will also put a link to more information on those in the show notes as well. And finally, please don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel. We produce new teachings every week and we would love to share your journey with you. Bye-bye.